J-O-L, Yall. And that means, well, Yall is a festival. It was an Old Norse or Scandinavian midwinter holiday festival from December 21st to January. And what you would do is you would get a great big log and throw it in the fire, and you would basically party until it burned, which would be about 12 days. And this is also, Yall, this Scandinavian word is where you get this word, jolly. Now, the whole merrymaking at Christmas tradition that suffuses the Christmas tradition actually has more pagan origins as well. Late fall, early winter, this is the time to slaughter animals that aren't going to make it through the winter, so you had lots of meat on hand. And you had wine and beer that you made earlier. Well, that's getting nice and ripe, and it's about time to start drinking that. So during the Middle Ages, and really on through the 19th century, it was the time for the poor to go out and cruise around from house to house and ask for some of this excess, some of this food. Especially a cup or two were wassail, which was spiced ale or wine or spirits. And to wassail means to enjoy good health. And I suppose when they would go around, they might sing a song or so, or two, and then so we do that today by going around to people's houses and singing Christmas carols. But also, it was a time to get a little bit, when you're merrymaking and you're drinking all that wine and you're drinking all that beer and you're stuffing yourself with roast pork and whatnot, you can get a little rowdy. And so it was ultimately frowned upon this time of year, Christmas, the celebration of Christmas, by Puritans, by Cromwell and his bunch. They actually outlawed Christmas in England. Right? I mean, we associate Christmas with very old England, right? It was actually against the law to celebrate it in the 17th century. And that was done away with when Charles II came back to the throne after Cromwell kicked him out. After Cromwell had assassinated his father, or executed his father. But in any event, in Puritan America, the Puritans brought that over, brought that anti-Christmas tradition over here with them. So here in New England, Christmas was not celebrated by the Puritans, by the Pilgrims. It was frowned upon. It was looked upon as being excessive and kind of sinful and licentious and all those things that the Puritans hated. Fun, essentially, right? So, but as a matter of fact, even into the 19th century, it was associated with rowdiness. There was this, one of the reasons that the New York Police Department actually was formed was in response to a Christmas riot. It was called the Christmas Riot of 1828, I think it was. The police were formed a little bit later, but at that time, it was just what was called the night watch. The guy walking around at 8 o'clock and all is well kind of thing. Well, when these rowdies celebrating Christmas began to tear up the streets and whatnot, they figured they needed a little bit more, muscle out there on the street. And so they began to talk about the formation of a police department in New York. And it actually Christmas wasn't declared a federal holiday until 1870, actually. Now, because of all this rowdiness, there was a movement in New York's kind of upper crust society to make Christmas, let's make it a kind of home for the holidays event. Let's calm this down. Let's make it nice and friendly and peaceful. And there was this image of Christmas. They got a lot of help fostering this image of Christmas from a great American writer, Washington Irving. Irving wrote a book called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gentleman. It's the book that contains two of his most famous stories, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. But he also has this story about this gentleman, Geoffrey Crayon, going to England, and he visits a manor at Christmas. And he talks to the squire, who tells him, things have just gone so terribly wrong here. The public, they're rowdy. They don't listen to us. They're they're starting to read newspapers and get ideas of their own. And what are we going to do about it? Well, I think maybe what we should do is invite them into our homes, perhaps at this time of year, and show them how what it's like to have a nice quiet time. And Irving writes a pretty hilarious story. He writes about how that was a big disaster because he invited all these people in off the street, and they just went in and trashed his house and drank up everything in sight and ate all his food and broke all the windows. And so he thought, well, all right, let's just, instead of doing that, why don't we go around and deliver packages and things to the poor instead of inviting them in. And this is one illustration on the bottom here from this book. You see a couple of upper crusty people out there. Look, darling, a pauper. This is the sort of sentiment that the story talks about. But someone who read and admired Irving was Charles Dickens. And his holiday classic, Christmas Carol, actually owes more to Irving, more to an American writer than the English tradition. The Christmas tree has long-time pagan roots. Oh, sorry. Tree, get it? Never mind. Anyway, the idea of bringing a tree inside, bringing something green inside, actually goes all the way back to Egyptian times, where the Egyptians would bring palms into their homes at the solstice, at the winter solstice. It's an idea of life in the spring will defeat this darkness. We will have life again. So the idea of bringing greenery in was a familiar one. Martin Luther is credited with erecting the first Christmas tree. According to legend, he was on his way home on a winter's night and was struck by the beauty of the twinkling stars among the fir trees and decided to show his family by recreating it in the house, by bringing one of these trees into the house. And that first Christmas, you can only imagine Mrs. Luther's delight. That it's not enough for you to be excommunicated. You've got to be dragging trees into the house. But in any event, this is a legendary beginning of the tradition. It's probably not true. It's a nice story. It's more likely that this idea of this tree decorated comes from medieval morality plays, which and the Feast of Adam and Eve, which is December 24th. And they'd be staged outside, and they'd be decorated. They'd decorate these trees to look like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? They'd hang these red apples from it. So it may be the inspiration for the Christmas balls, for the red Christmas balls. The Nativity and Christmas pageant, those morality plays, were also the origin of the Christmas pageant. And actually, it was St. Francis of Assisi who staged the first Christmas pageant. Decided to have it inside the church, have characters looking like the figures, impersonating the figures, and ultimately became, instead of live figures, although we still do Christmas pageants, of course, but ultimately they moved outside and then they became just statues, the creche that we see today. And the nativity scene, the Christmas pageant, the nativity scene, the creche, these are actually conflations of the two Gospels that discuss the birth of Jesus. And you can see not all the details are, the details are merged. In one there's wise men, and in another there's no wise men. There's shepherds in one, but there's no shepherds in the other. So that it's been shoved together. And I tell this joke every time I give this talk. If the three wise men had been the three wise women, they would have asked for directions. They would have arrived on time. They would have helped deliver the baby, cleaned the stable, made a casserole, and brought some practical gifts. Now, the tree as we know it today was actually popularized by Victoria and Albert in Britain's Victoria and Albert in the 1840s. The picture on the left here is, you can see Victoria, the young Queen Victoria and her husband Albert, with their children, and I believe that's Victoria's mother in the back there. Victoria introduced the tree to Buckingham Palace because her mother was German, and so, so maybe this Luther legend or what have you has a bit of validity, because she brought the idea of celebrating with the Christmas tree from Germany. Even like today, the things that people, that the upper crust, the aristocrats are doing, catches on with the rest of us, right? And so in America, you can see this illustration on the right. This is from an American magazine. And what they simply did, I think I can get a pointer going here. Yeah. Where are you? Is they replaced Albert's sash with a vest there. They took away Victoria's monarchist tiara there, and I think, what did they just put a little comb or something? I can't quite see what she's got there. And the mother becomes just maybe a servant, or it could be the mother as well. But it was co-opted, right? It was popular and co-opted. Now, in 1822, Clement Clark Moore wrote and published his classic. Moore was an Episcopal minister and a professor of Oriental and Greek literature at Columbia, a biblical scholar. And despite his association with this childhood, cheerful, warm childhood classic, Moore himself was actually pretty much a sourpuss. I mean, he was not exactly a humanitarian. I mean, he opposed the abolition of slavery. He opposed the development for homes for the working class in New York, and taxes going to things like sidewalks. But he developed the sole property there for his rich friends in what became Chelsea. Now, there's actually some debate about whether or not the guy actually wrote this thing. He probably did. But I'm sure he's spinning in his grave to know that, after he was this great, he considered himself, and he was a great scholar at Columbia, and this is all he's remembered for, is this little poem, an account of the visit of St. Nicholas. The poem he was initially hesitant to publish, supposedly, due to its frivolous nature in the subject, is largely responsible for our modern image of Santa Claus as the right jolly old elf. With this portly figure with the supernatural ability to ascend the chimney with a mere nod of his head. Moore mixed together a number of European legends. The gift-giving is from the Dutch St. Nicholas. The Norse god Thor's sleigh was pulled by flying goats. Now we have reindeer. The chimney descent of a mythical visitor from German and French traditions, and also a French and Italian practice of hanging. Get to be December 25th. I've done quite a bit of homework on this. As some of you know, I run adult Christian education programs at Calvary Church here, and so I investigate a lot of these types of topics. A lot of what you're going to hear tonight is a conglomeration of scholarship, some of it inspired by Andrew McGowan, who is Dean and President of the Berkeley Divinity School at Yale. Some of his scholarship informs the basic outline of what I want to say, and to which I've added various things. It's been said that when you take information from one source, it's plagiarism. When you take it from many, it's called research. So, in any event, why December 25th? If you look at the Gospels, if you look in the Bible, there's no mention of December 25th as the date of Jesus' birth. There's no mention in the Acts of the Apostles or in the Epistles. So it appears nowhere in the Christian Bible. And there's actually no mention of it by the early church fathers, the writings of the early church fathers, 1st, 2nd century, when Christianity was beginning to gel, beginning to take off. And yet there's no mention of this date. And for such an important event, you'd think it would be there. Actually, the earliest references to dates that we have for Christmas come from the writings of this fellow, Clement of Alexandria, who was a bishop and a church father. And writing in the 3rd century, he looked around, he was based in Egypt, Alexandria is in Egypt, and he looked around at the various Christian sects that were percolating in the area and the region, and they came up with different dates for Christmas. As you can see, for the birth of Christ. As you can see, a lot of these are in the spring, which makes sense in some ways, right? Because this is when shepherds would be tending their flock, according to Luke. And the spring is lambing season. So that's why the shepherds would be out there with their flocks. Lambing season is the sheep are born in the spring, and it gives them plenty of time to grow their fleece, so they're all set for the winter. Whereas we have to put on wool and sweaters, they naturally have them. So, by the 4th century, there are references now to 2 dates. December 25th appears for the first time in the 4th century in the West, and January 6th in the East. When I say the West and the East, I'm talking about the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. Known as the January 6th, of course, in the West is known as the Feast of the Epiphany, when the Magi arrive, the wise men. The period in between December 25th and January 6th are, what, 12 days, the 12 days of Christmas. So by the 4th century, we have a midwinter date settled upon. Now why? Why did it go from spring to finally being codified, if you will, on this December date? Well, there are several theories. Some of them are popular and well-known, and some are not quite so well-known. The most popular theory about why Christmas is celebrated in December 25th, was that this was a date that was borrowed from the Roman midwinter festival of Saturnalia, which was in honor of the god of agriculture. Around 270 CE, Common Era AD, the Emperor Aurelian also established December 25th as the day to celebrate Sol Invictus, S-O-L, Sol, or the unconquered sun. Now to understand this, what this festival is, this Roman festival, the unconquered sun, I'm going to take a brief, promise you brief, digression into a look at the origins of the 7-day week, because it's important to understand that. The concept of the week, the 7-day week, dates to antiquity, when Babylonian astronomers and Egyptian astrologers assigned particular days of the week to heavenly bodies. They named them after the heavenly bodies, namely Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. So that's where you get the 7. Jews as well operated on a 7-day week based on the creation narrative, right, in Genesis, in which God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. The Romans adopted this custom, this 7-day week, from the Egyptians during the 1st and 2nd centuries. And the day of the sun became dies solis, or the day of the sun, that's what it means. In Roman Gaul, that was anglicized, or Germanicized, I should say. And I'm going to flip back and forth here into this word. That's how you say it in German. What does that look like? Say it out loud. Say it with me. Sonntag.
Sonntag.
Sounds like Sunday, doesn't it? Well, that's where you get the word Sunday.
Or Susan.
Yeah. Now, going a step further, as they often did when absorbing the traditions of client kingdoms and conquered peoples, the Romans customized this basic concept of Sunday to suit their own religious preferences. So Sunday became a day sacred to Deus Sol Invictus, or God, the undefeated sun. So there's a special day named for the God of the sun, or God the sun. And it had a cult of its own with various times, various emperors attached themselves to it, adopted it, and thought this was the greatest thing. And among them was Aurelian, who, as I said, in 270, introduced worship of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, as an official religion. And the date that Aurelian chose to dedicate a temple to the sun god was familiar to pagans as the occasion of the sun's midwinter rebirth, when the longer daylight hours begin, gradually return, and this became later familiar to Christians as the date of Jesus' birth. So he chose December 25th as this special day. And interestingly, you'll find, although there's some historians dispute this, but there are representations of Jesus as this sun god that are found. The image on the right there is from the bowels of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And that depicts Jesus as a youthful, clean-shaven man riding a chariot, kind of an Apollo-like figure. But this is believed to be one of the earliest representations of Jesus, actually, in the earliest days of the church. So, December 25th was a familiar Roman sacred day. That's what the last 2 minutes what I was just talking about was trying to drive home. That December 25th was a day that was known to the Romans as a sacred day. The idea of the early church missions to celebrate holidays at the same time was to attract pagans. So as Christianity spread throughout the Roman world, the church thought, well, let's try and adopt some local customs to attract the pagans. It was like a recruiting tool, if you will, to recruit people to the new faith. And there were many concepts that early, Christian converts could understand. That God had a son, for instance. Well, Zeus had a son. And so that kind of made sense, and so various elements would be familiar to them. And a good example, actually, of this adaptation is the oldest parish church in the UK, St. Martin's, which is in Canterbury, not too far from Canterbury Cathedral. And it was the private chapel of Queen Bertha of Kent, and was built in the 6th century before Augustine arrived, before St. Augustine, not Augustine of Hippo, but Augustine, the missionary to the British Isles, arrived from Rome. Bertha was a Christian Frankish princess who arrived in England with her chaplain, and her husband, the man that she married, was a guy named Ethelbert of Kent, and he allowed her to continue to practice her religion. She eventually converted him. Women, actually, in Europe, in the early days of the church, were tremendously impactful. And it was often the queen would convince the king to become Christian, and thereby the nation became Christian. Women have always been incredibly important in the church, supporters, and just demonstrating great strength. And if any man in the audience has any doubts about the ability of women, just think about this: that Ginger Rogers, had to learn every dance step Fred Astaire did, except she had to do them backwards, and in heels. So women are incredibly capable. So, in any event, this chapel here, St. Martin's, it's a very interesting place if you ever go there to Canterbury, because if you go right to the back there, to the sanctuary, the remains of the Roman temple are there, right in the back. You can see the brick layers of the Roman temple. So anyway, this just illustrates how the church would adopt and build upon places. So when they were going out and spreading out throughout Europe, and they found pagan temples, and that's what this previous slide was about here, that the Pope Gregory was writing to Augustine, saying, look, if you come upon these places, don't tear them down. Let's just recycle them. Let's just use them again. For various reasons, for practical reasons, because, it saved you the trouble of rebuilding a building. Material was hard to come by, particularly finished stones. And then also because these sacred places were familiar to pagans. So why not re-emphasize their importance, but with the new faith. So, now it's true that some elements retain their kind of a bit of paganism, like the Christmas tree, for instance, which has its roots in Druidic roots, and also more familiarly is the mistletoe. Druids believed that it was a plant that fell to earth from heaven, so it's a kind of joining of heaven and earth, and a sort of reconciliation, if you will, between these two opposing forces. And as such, it came to symbolize a gesture of goodwill, and between enemies, between opposing forces, between heaven and earth, between opposing forces. This gesture of goodwill, the mistletoe, came down. So, and eventually, it morphed into a gesture of proposal between a man and a woman. And nowadays, of course, it's just good for cheap thrill office Christmas party after a few eggnogs, but that's why you kiss under the mistletoe. So these are all the theories, or not all of them, but these are many theories about this adoption of a Roman pagan holiday, Saturnalia, to attract and assure pagan converts of Christianity's validity and their importance, and to help them kind of blend as a date for Christmas. There's still this nagging question of, well, why wasn't it found in any of the early Christian writings? Why wasn't it referred to? Plus, the early Christians would only go so far with adopting pagan customs and festivals and whatnot. So it's unlikely that they would choose Saturnalia, December 25th, as the date of birth. Well, the answer may not lie so much in Jesus' birth as it does with the date of his death. According to the Gospel of John, Christ died as the Passover lambs are being slaughtered. This would have taken place on the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan, which is March or April in the Jewish calendar. The Jews used a lunar calendar and had different names for the months. In about 200, the church father Tertullian, working backwards through emperors and their reigns, which is how Romans would calculate things, or so many years since Emperor so-and-so. So Tertullian, working backwards through the reigns of the emperors, calculated that the 14th of Nisan, in the year that Jesus died, would have been March 25th in the Roman calendar. March 25th was later recognized also as the Feast of the Annunciation, because it fell in the spring. It was a time of renewal. And it was one of the 4 calendric dates that divided the year into quarters, the same way we have fiscal quarters. So Jesus was conceived and crucified on the same day, March 25th. Now, you guys can sit there and do the math on your fingers if you want, it's okay. March 25th, if Jesus was conceived on March 25th, when was he born? April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. 9 months later. December 25th. Now, according to the Julian calendar, March 25th was the spring equinox, and for pagans, this was the anniversary of the creation of the world. So that date for Jesus' birth, or I should say conception, really appealed to many Christians, because Paul identified Christ as the new Adam, a new beginning, and this tradition is also mentioned in the 5th century by the great church father Augustine. The Eastern Church as well recognized this, but instead of the 14th of Nisan, they calculated the 14th of the first spring month, their first spring month, using the Greek calendar, which begins not in January, but after the first full moon, after the summer solstice. So that corresponds to April 6th in our calendar. So if you go 9 months from April 6th, you come up with January 6th, which is when, in the Armenian church today, Armenian Orthodox, that's when they celebrate Christmas, January 6th. Or excuse me, January 7th. And So, and we're going to get into calendars in a moment, because calendars are very, very important. So the idea of Christ's birth and death being bound together by the same date reflects ancient and medieval understandings of salvation being bound together by these events. You can see in this medieval artwork, for instance, the infant Jesus, right, coming from the Father, bearing a cross. So his birth and his death are tied together. This would have been understood to the medieval Christian mind. And this idea of something happening on the same date, his conception and his death happening on the same day, is an idea rooted in Judaism. Jewish tradition taught that great figures like Moses were born and died on the same day. This tradition of dates, especially Nisan, as important reminders, is found in Jewish tradition. In the Talmud, there's discussion of the world created during the month of Nisan. Isaac was born then. The future, we're going to be redeemed then. So this idea of things happening on the same date was cultural, and something that early Jewish Christians, because that's what they were in the beginning, may have adopted. So, now that we're maybe relatively sure of how we got to December 25th, let's see if we can maybe get the year right. Okay, can we get that right? Well, actually not really, because Jesus was likely born in 5 BC. Now, how can that be? Well, let's look at this AD BC business here. Early Christians used the Julian calendar, which was based on the old Roman calendar. It was a 10-month calendar. And then the Julian calendar was rejiggered, and they shoved a couple of extra, actually they made a couple of extra months out of it to make it 12 months. In 525 AD, or CE, a Syrian monk by the name of Dionysius Exiguus was called upon to cleanse the calendar of all the old Roman feast days, these pagan feast dates and whatnot, and come up with a date for, or a way to figure out Easter, the date of Easter, it would be universal throughout the church. And that's very important. Universality was very important in the early church. Dionysius also reinforced this March 25th date for the Annunciation by making March 25th the beginning of the new year, just as the conception of Jesus in Mary's womb was a new beginning for the world. So he decided to date the new calendar from the birth of Jesus, using the Roman method of dating events by calculating years of reigns of emperors and Roman consuls. But he committed 2 big mistakes. All right, let's illustrate that for you. If you look, say we have our calendar here, okay, and here we have BC or AD as we learned them in grade school. Today the more politically correct is BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era. But, okay, if Jesus is born here, this would have been the year of 1, okay? But there's the first mistake. Because Dionysius forgot that there was a year 0. In the same way we went from 1999 to 2000. We didn't go from 1999 to 2001. There was that year 2000 in there. There was that 12-month period. But he didn't include that. Now, one of the reasons he didn't include it was because there was no 0 in the Roman numeral. Roman numerals didn't have a 0. The concept of 0 was actually introduced by the Arabs I think it was in the 11th century. And they stole it from the Indians. And well, that's why we call them Arabic numerals today. Right? But this idea of 0 didn't exist in that part of the world. So he can be forgiven for that. But now we've lost a year. Okay? And then, for some reason, when he was counting back through emperors, he did not include the first 4 years of Augustus's reign as emperor. Before he was called Augustus, he was called Octavian. So he forgot to include those. So now you're going back and he's lost 5 years. So 5 BC, what he thought was this year 1, was actually 5 BC. Okay, now we got more trouble ahead. Because some historians believe that Jesus may have been born actually even earlier, 6 BC, 7 BC. How did that happen? Well, the death of Herod provides a clue. According to the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who was born right around the time of Jesus' death, Herod died in 4 BC. 4 BC. So, how did he know that Herod died in 4 BC? Or how do we know that? Well, because Josephus records that he died after a lunar eclipse and before Passover. Now, astronomers who know how to calculate these things have determined that the only lunar eclipse that would have occurred at this time and was visible in Jerusalem happened in 4 BC. So Herod, as we know, ordered the slaying of the children of Bethlehem, right? So if he did this in 4 BC, Jesus would have already have been born by then. But in the Gospels, the Greek word that's used when Herod sent his soldiers out to slaughter the innocents and slaughter the children was this word, the Greek word pais. And that doesn't mean baby. It means toddler. It means somebody who hasn't been schooled yet. So at this point, Herod was sending out his troops to kill the toddlers, not the infants. So that would mean that Jesus in 4 BC was probably, I don't know, could have been 2, toddling around, maybe 3 or so. So somewhere in there. So, Christmas, the day of Christmas, we can just to quickly summarize here, then I'm just going to move on to just a few traditions, was in April, May, March of Santa Claus. His cartoon, which appeared in Harper's Weekly, depicted Santa as a rotund, cheerful man with a full white beard, holding a sack of toys for the lucky children. And it was Nast who gave Santa his bright red suit, trimmed with white fur, and his North Pole workshop, and elves, and even his wife. He married Santa off. He fixed Santa up with Mrs. Claus. All Nast did all this. Well, Coca-Cola is commonly credited with creating and popularizing the most familiar image of Santa as the chubby, jolly, grandfatherly figure there in the red suit in the 1930s. But it was actually White Rock Beverages in Whitestone, New York, in 1915 that created the Santa here that we see associated with this commercialism. And he remains so to this day. So I've talked quite enough, and you've all been good little boys and girls. I'll make sure to tell Santa. If you have any questions, I could try and answer them. I think I've told you pretty much everything I know about Christmas, but yes?
How did they come up with the idea that the Feast of the Assumption was March 25th?
How did they come up with the...
How did they decide that March 25th was the Feast of the Assumption?
Okay. Annunciation, actually.
Annunciation.
Because that date was a date of renewal. The spring began. And so it would have been taking place on this date of the renewal of the world, meaning the spring, the beginning of the spring, the beginning of everything. So it made sense to them.
So it's not historical at all?
It's not historical, no. No, it's more theological. It's more theological. March 25th.
It's convenient.
As being, what's that?
It's convenient.
Yes, it is convenient. But again, if you go from that date, March 25th, again, you count out 9 months. That's how December 25th, or at least that's one theory of how December 25th was arrived at. Yeah.
Who is St. Nicholas that Clement Moore mentions?
Who is St. Nicholas?
Yeah.
actually Ted could probably tell you more about St. Nicholas, he's our Turkish expert, but he was a Turkish bishop in the 4th century, I think? Yeah, 4th century. I can't remember where he was from.
Why is he mentioned in the Night Before Christmas?
Pardon me?
Why is he mentioned in the Night Before Christmas poem?
Well, because by then, by the time Moore wrote his poem, he had become associated with a lot of the traditions of Christmas. A lot of these, like I said, the giving away of toys to poor children, and coming down the chimney and whatnot. I mean, I believe the coming down the chimney part was initially started with him. I believe the original saint left some gold coins for poor children in the chimney, in the ashes of the chimney. So it was assumed that they came down the chimney, and that he dropped them down. So the original Saint Nicholas, whose feast day is December 6th, I believe, was eventually all these traditions became piled on to him by different cultures across Europe mostly. Yeah.
There was another legend of St. Nicholas that he threw a bag of gold into the house of a poor man who couldn't afford a dowry for his daughter so that he could get married. He was supposed to have done this 3 separate times. So that was another gift giving.
Yeah. So he's associated with the giving of gifts. Yes.
Do we know when the census took place in Bethlehem?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm working from memory here. John would ask, do we know when the census was in Bethlehem? Or, that's in Luke, I believe. I think it's how Luke.
That's where they went.
What's that?
They had to go.
Right, but that, it says it was when Quirinius was governor. And according to Roman records, Quirinius wasn't governor then. So there's a bit of a conflict there. I'm not sure how it has been resolved, but there's conflicting information there about when that census was taken. The Romans did do a census because they did want to tax everything and make sure they had kept track of everything. But now, I believe one theory is that, the gospel writer misidentifies Quirinius, or it might have been another Quirinius. There are a lot of theories about that. Christmas is a fascinating, you can spend your whole career just examining Christmas. Yeah.
There was another story I found fascinating, was that the wise men were actually students at the college in Babylon, and sort of star astrology in Babylon, and that they believed that when Jupiter and Venus had a conjunction twice in 1 year, it turned out, that this meant something very important was going to happen, and they conjuncted in the house of Pisces, and Pisces was somehow associated with the Holy Land. And that's why the wise man came there and said, we believe somebody important is going to be born here, what do you know about it? And that was supposed to have been in 4 BC, I think. Have you heard any of that?
Well, the Star of Bethlehem is another topic, a great topic. I mean, we won't talk on the Star of Bethlehem, I have actually in the past. But the wise men may have been from Babylon, they may have actually been from Turkey. Because the earliest depiction of the wise men is in a church in Ravenna, Italy, St. Apollinare. And it shows them wearing very identifiable Turkish clothing. Phrygia, the northern part of Turkey, is where they may have come from. And they're wearing caps. They're kind of like Santa caps, actually. And trousers. Of course, back then, most people wore sort of tunic kind of outfits. So they're clearly identified as Phrygian or Turkish. And also, another thing about the wise men, the Gospels mentions nothing about 3 wise men, let alone 3 kings. it never gives a number. It just says that wise men came from the east. Go look at it when you go home. Look it up. It doesn't mention 3 at all. Nor that they were kings. The reason we got 3 was because of the gifts they brought: gold, frankincense, myrrh. So we just inferred that they were 3. But some traditions have as many as 7, 10, 12 wise men coming. And they may well have been astrologers, probably astrologers, people who studied the sky and would have noted some anomaly. The star development is a fascinating topic.
In art, they're often depicted as youth, middle age, and age, and sometimes from 3 different continents:
That's right.
Africa, Asia, and Europe.
Right. To represent, and that's a great point, I'm glad you brought that up. It represents, of course, the entire known world at that point in time coming to worship. And all ages: youth, middle age, old age. And then Africa, as you say, sometimes an Asian king is depicted and a black king. So it would be Africa, Asia, and the West all coming to worship. So, well, if there are no more questions, I thank you for coming. There's some refreshments here, and so now you can just go explore your relatives.